This is the 15 most prolific serial killers the world has ever seen. I'm not going to go into massive detail because we'll be here for 15 hours, but they will be ordered so that the most prolific is last. And as we go through, I'll tell you a bit about each serial killer. First on our list is Gary Ridgway. He was known as the Green River Killer. He was born on the 18th of February 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, US. He had 2 brothers and is known to have had a bit of a troubled upbringing. Relatives have described his mom as domineering, and he witnessed a few violent arguments between his parents. An interesting bit of detail is his dad was a bus driver, and he quite often complained about the presence of sex workers around the local area. At the age of 13, Gary Ridgway still had a bedwetting problem, and still at that age, every time he had an issue of wetting his bed, his mom would clean his genitals. He later told defence psychologists that as an adolescent, he had conflicting feelings about his mom. The conflicting feelings were of anger and sexual attraction, and he did also fantasise about killing her. He's dyslexic and he was held back a year at school. When he was 16, he found a 6-year-old boy, he led him into the woods, and he stabbed him through the ribs into his liver. Fortunately for the boy, he did survive. Gary went on to marry his 19-year-old high school sweetheart, Claudia Craig. Shortly after that, he joined the US Navy and he was sent to Vietnam. During his time in the Navy, he quite often had sex with sex workers, and by doing so, he contracted gonorrhea. Gary was obviously quite angry about this, but he did continue to sleep with sex workers and without protection. His first marriage ended within 1 year. In fact, his first 2 marriages ended in divorce because of infidelities by both partners. And his second wife claimed that his second wife was called Marcia Winslow, and she did claim that he'd placed her in a chokehold. While in that second marriage, Gary became very religious. He would go door to door, he would read him the Bible out loud, both at work and at home. And he also insisted that his wife followed the strict teachings of their pastor. Interestingly, Gary Ridgway quite often cried while reading the Bible or during sermons. But despite his now apparent strong beliefs, he was still using sex workers. Not only that, he did also want his wife to perform public sex. And not only were it in public, it was quite often in inappropriate places. And it would later to become clear that some of the places he wanted to have sex with her were where these bodies were found. According to all the women in his life, Gary Ridgway had a very insatiable appetite for sex. His 3 ex-wives and several ex-girlfriends all claimed that Gary wanted sex at least several times a day. And again, they all said that he wanted to have sex in public areas or in the woods. Even Gary admitted that he had a fascination, a fixation with sex workers. But Gary was very conflicted. He often moaned about the presence, but he also took very much advantage of their services. My final note is that Gary had a child with his second wife, Marcia. It was a boy. On the 30th of November 2001, Gary Ridgway was working at a truck factory. When he left the factory to go home, he was arrested for the murders of 4 women. These cases had been linked to Gary by DNA profiling. After these arrests, Gary was described by friends and relatives as friendly but strange. As a part of Gary's plea bargain, he said that he would tell the police where there were still some undiscovered dead bodies. He was convicted of murdering 49 women. That makes him the second most prolific murderer in US history. Because of his plea deal, he was spared the death sentence and he was sentenced to a life imprisonment with absolutely no chance of parole. His killings were all women, teenage girls usually, and they were always based in Washington in the 1980s and 1990s. Most of the victims were alleged sex workers, and like we said, there were teenagers in there. That's because they were also targeting other vulnerable women, including underage runaways. His first 5 victims were found in the Green River, hence his nickname, that were given to him by the press, by the way. And he strangled his victims by hand, but he quite often used a ligature as well. After strangling the victims, he dumped their bodies in forested areas or overgrown areas in King County. And then he quite often returned to the dead bodies after he dumped them to have sex with them. It's proven that Gary Ridgway killed 49 women, but it's also thought that he could have killed up to 90. Robert William Willy Pickton was born on the 24th of October 1949. He's Canadian's most prolific killer. His family were pig farmers based 17 miles east of Vancouver. He had 1 brother and 1 sister. His older sister, which we call Linda, She was sent to live with relatives in Vancouver because his family thought that it weren't quite the right place to raise a lady on a pig farm, so she went off to Vancouver. But Robert and his younger brother David, they worked on the farm from quite a young age. The mum were quite demanding, and she quite often prioritised the pigs over the boys' personal hygiene. And of course, as you can expect from that sentence, the boys were forced to work long hours working on the farm's livestock and keep them happy and maintained. This meant that the boys also had to attend school, and they were quite unwashed and dirty uniforms, and they stunk of manure, and this ended up getting the boys the nickname Stinky Pigs. Willy Pickton had a really strong attachment to his mom, but his dad were a bit abusive, and he had very little interaction with him. In his early teens, he used his savings to buy a calf, and this calf became his absolutely life and soul. It was his beloved pet. But one day he came home from school and he was looking for his calf everywhere and he couldn't find him. So his mum said, go and check the barn. When he walked into the barn, he found his calf slaughtered. He dropped out of school in 1963 at the age of 14 and became a butcher's apprentice. Then in 1970, he quit the apprenticeship and went to work full-time on the farm. His father died in 1978 and then his mother died the following year, and that means they left the farm to Andy's siblings. Linda and David, though, they didn't quite want the farm, so David took the house and Gary took the farm. And then he lived on the farm in a caravan in a remote corner. But from this point, the farm really started to go downhill. Both the brothers were rejecting the farm's operations, really. They weren't maintaining it like they should. They then registered a non-profit charity called the Piggy Palace Good Time Society. That were in 1996, and they claimed to organise, coordinate, manage and operate special events, functions, dances, shows and exhibitions on behalf of service organisations, sports organisations and other worthy groups. Its events included raves, parties featuring Vancouver sex workers and gatherings in a converted slaughterhouse on the farm. These events attracted as many as 2,000 people, so they were quite popular. It's believed that these murders started to happen in the early 1980s, shortly after he'd inherited the farm. He was arrested in 2002 and he was convicted in 2007 of second-degree murder for 6 women. Subsequently, he was subject to a lengthy investigation, and this brought up evidence of quite a few other murders. Pickton was charged with the deaths of an additional 20 women. Many of them were from the Vancouver downtown east side, but these charges were stayed by the Crown in 2010. Now, I looked at what stayed mean because I've never really heard it before, but it means it just stops. It's quite weird. I think, picture this, you're going through a court trial and stuff, but it takes far too long for the trial to start. So at that point, the Crown thinks, this is quite bad for the justice system, so they stay it. Instead of just being on hold anymore, it's just stopped. If the Crown stays a trial, they can then bring it back within a year. After a year, they can no longer bring it back. I think if a judge stays it, then they can't bring it back. But it was the Crown that stayed it at this time, which basically means that it's not really going anywhere, it's not fair, it don't look good on the justice system, so we're going to stop it. Pickton confessed to 49 murders to an undercover agent. The agent was from the Office of Inspector General, and he was posing as a cellmate. He also told the officer, the undercover cellmate, that he wanted to kill another woman to make it up to around even 50, adding that he only got caught because he was sloppy. Robert Willy Pickton was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. At the time, that was the longest possible sentence for second-degree murder in Canadian law. He murdered 49 women and fed them to his pigs. Florisvaldo de Oliveira was commonly known as Capo Bruno. He was born on the 18th of November 1958. He was from Sao Paulo, Brazil, and his nickname Capo Bruno came because his childhood friends compared him to an alcoholic called Bruno. This nickname became that common, even his mom started to call him. Capo Bruno was an ex-policeman, and he's said to have become a bit of a vigilante. In other words, he went around killing people for what he perceived to be justice. It was said that he killed for hating the fringes, although testimonials suggested that he did also kill people because of the victim's appearance. Jose Benedictio was the first survivor and only survivor of one of his murders, and that's because after he was shot, he played dead. He pretended he was dead, and then when it was safe to do so, he got up and escaped. After his first arrest in 1983, he was sentenced to 113 years in prison. The reality is, he was sentenced for leading a group of people that killed dozens of people, and he also extorted shops on the outskirts of Brazil's largest city. During his jail sentence, he became a pastor of an evangelical church. After serving 27 years of his 113-year sentence, he was released early from prison on the grounds of good behaviour. He left jail on the 23rd of August 2012. Just over a month later, on the 26th of September 2012, at 11:30 p.m, so at night, Capo Bruno was returning from a religious service with his family when he was killed by 18 to 20 shots. These shots were fired by two men on foot, and although his relatives, they were all unarmed. You could romanticise this and say Florisvaldo de Oliveira killed 50 criminals. However, he weren't no Batman, and it is possible that he could have killed more than 50, but the solid number is 50. Ivan Stepanovich Maleshoff was known as the Bluebird of Kharkiv. Surprisingly, there isn't that much information about this guy, especially on the surface of the web. He is reported to have killed 20 women in Kharkiv over a period of several months. For anyone wondering, Kharkiv is in Ukraine, and that were in 1935. He did these murders with a knife, leaving behind little clues to his identity other than taunting letter to the police. Yes, he left letters to the police after each murder. It's reported that when he was caught by police, he was actually attempting to kill his next victim. He was completely unaware that the entire time had been tailed, and the police saw that he was about to murder somebody else and jumped out and ambushed him. Earlier that day, though, he was about to be arrested by a female officer before he fled. And like I said, that's pretty much from when they tailed him. He was about to kill somebody else, and they jumped on him. Prior to his execution, he confessed to an additional 30 murders in nearby Kiev in 1934. Ivan Stepanovich Maleshoff killed 50 people, and for that he was convicted and executed in 1935 by firing squad at the age of 40. Anatoly has a middle name, but I'm not even going to try and pronounce it, so we're just going to stick with Anatoly Onoprienko, was a Soviet-Ukrainian serial mass murderer, born on the 25th of July 1959. He was also known for the nicknames The Beast of Ukraine, The Terminator and Citizen O. After police arrested a 36-year-old former forestry student on the 16th of April 1996, Anatoly confessed to killing 52 people. He had one brother, and his father fought in World War II, although that's well before he was born. When Anatoly was 4 years old, his mom died, and he then went to live with his grandparents before being put into an orphanage. Anatoly went on to resent his father for this, which is not quite surprising because his father did keep the custody of his brother. Anatoly went on to blame this. He said that this had predetermined his destiny, and he also went on to talk about statistics of people that grow up in orphanages end up in prison. And I think at the time, I don't know if the statistic was true then, I don't know if the statistic's true now, but at the time he claimed that 70% of people that grow up in orphanages end up in prison as adults. When finally arrested, he had in his possession 122 items. These items included a sawn-off shotgun, a number of other weapons which were used to murder several people, and a number of items that he'd taken off victims. While in police custody, he confessed to another 8 killings, all of which were between 1989 and 1995. At first, he denied all charges, but ultimately he came to confess to all 52 killings within them 6 years. And something that's not uncommon with serial killers, he also said that it was a voice inside his head that was telling him to do so. The earliest killing that Anatoly did was a family of 10, a mom, a dad and 8 children. He'd been robbing their house and they caught him, so he killed them all. There was an accomplice with him at that time. In the same year, 5 people, including an 11-year-old boy, were shot dead while sleeping in a car. Subsequently, the car was set on fire and all the bodies were burnt. Anatoly says that he never intended to kill him, he was just trying to steal the car. But as you go on looking at Anatoly's murders, they all do follow that pattern. Well, most of them follow that pattern. They're all families, they're all groups of people. There's never one where he just killed somebody. It seemed that most of the time that he were killing people, it were a family. Anatoly Onoprienko killed 52 people. That's been proven. And some people believe he could have killed more. He was sentenced to death. However, that was later reduced to life in prison, and then he went on to die from heart failure in 2013. So that's it. That's the first 5 of the 15 worst killers. Next week, I'm going to bring you the next 5, so that'll be 10 through to 5. And then the week after, we'll do the 5 worst. I hope you've enjoyed this. I know it's something different. I know it's not Stranger Than Fiction. We will get back to them, although I might have a couple of weeks off doing the Stranger Than Fiction so I can really get into the true crime. If you've got any thoughts, if there's information that weren't quite accurate, or there's information that we're missing that you think I should have really put in there, please do put it in the comments. And just put it in comments anywhere. Please share it out. Please subscribe. Please like. Until next time, guys.